They called the emergency board meeting for 2:30 sharp, but I could tell from the moment I walked into that marble conference room that my career at Sterling Financial was about to end. The energy was all wrong. Too polished, too rehearsed. Marcus Blackwood, our chief executive officer, stood at the head of the mahogany table with his signature confident smile, the same one he wore whenever he was about to make a decision that would benefit him at someone else's expense. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I took my usual seat near the middle, close enough to hear every word but far enough to observe the room dynamics. Most of the senior staff avoided eye contact with me, which wasn't unusual anymore. Ever since I'd started asking uncomfortable questions about the quarterly projections and moved my office away from the executive wing, people had been treating me like I was already gone. It was easier for them to pretend I didn't exist. Marcus tapped his Mont Blanc pen against his water glass for attention. Before we discuss our third quarter performance, he announced, his voice carrying that theatrical tone he used for dramatic effect, "I have some important news to share with everyone." The room fell silent, that kind of suffocating quiet that happens right before someone's world gets turned upside down. "We're restructuring our leadership team to align with our new strategic vision," he continued, his eyes scanning the room before landing directly on mine. "And as part of this transition, Sarah Chen, today marks your final day with Sterling Financial." Scattered murmurs rippled through the room. A few people actually nodded approvingly, probably thinking this was some kind of promotion or voluntary departure package. I didn't flinch, didn't react at all. I just held his gaze steadily, watching as that practiced smile of his grew wider. "Sarah, you've been a valuable team member, but our future requires a different approach to financial oversight. Nothing personal, of course." I stood up slowly, deliberately, and reached for my briefcase. My hands were completely steady as I gathered my things, each movement calculated and calm. I walked around that conference table with 20 pairs of eyes tracking my every step, past the junior analysts who used to whisper about my attention to detail behind my back. The office had emptied out hours earlier, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of cleaning crews working their way through the building. I was reviewing the quarterly compliance reports when I noticed something strange in the subsidiary financial statements. Sterling Financial had been quietly acquiring small stakes in companies across 3 different industries, but the pattern didn't make sense from a traditional investment perspective. The purchases were too strategic, too targeted. It looked less like portfolio diversification and more like someone was positioning for something much bigger. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I spent the next 2 weeks analyzing every transaction, every filing, every piece of documentation I could get my hands on. What I discovered was so significant that I actually had to double-check my findings 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. Marcus Blackwood and his inner circle weren't just making random investments. They were systematically positioning Sterling Financial to be acquired by Meridian Capital, one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. They were doing it in a way that would personally enrich themselves while leaving regular shareholders and employees completely in the dark. The merger wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. And based on the timeline I was able to piece together from the documentation, it was going to happen within the next 12 to 18 months. Marcus had been negotiating this deal for over a year, carefully structuring everything to maximize his own golden parachute while minimizing the payout to everyone else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I realized I was sitting on information that could change everything. This wasn't just insider knowledge, this was evidence of potential securities fraud. The kind of information that could bring down careers, destroy reputations, and land people in federal prison. And I was apparently the only person at Sterling Financial who had bothered to connect the dots. That night, I didn't go home until almost midnight. Instead, I sat in my office and created a detailed digital file documenting everything I'd discovered. Transaction records, email communications, financial projections, regulatory filings, everything that painted a clear picture of what Marcus and his team were really doing. But I didn't stop there. Over the next several weeks, I quietly expanded my investigation. I started paying closer attention to conversations in the executive wing, noting which meetings I was suddenly excluded from and which decisions were being made without any input from the compliance department. I documented every instance where my recommendations were ignored or overruled without explanation. The pattern became clearer every day. They were systematically pushing me out of important discussions because they knew I was too thorough, too honest, too likely to ask the kinds of questions that would expose their scheme. They needed me gone before the merger talks became public knowledge. So I started preparing for exactly that scenario. Every email I sent, every report I filed, every recommendation I made, I kept detailed backup copies in a secure cloud storage system that nobody at Sterling knew existed. I documented meetings, recorded phone calls where legally permitted, and built a comprehensive timeline of everything that was happening behind closed doors. I also started reaching out to contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission, not to blow the whistle yet, but to establish relationships and understand exactly what kind of evidence would be needed if I ever decided to file a formal complaint. I learned about whistleblower protections, about how to properly document potential securities violations, about what kinds of rewards were available for people who helped uncover major financial fraud. By the time summer arrived, I had built a case so solid that it could have been used as evidence in federal court. I had proof of the merger negotiations, documentation of the self-dealing, evidence of the attempts to manipulate share prices, and a clear timeline showing how they had deliberately excluded shareholders from information they had a legal right to know. But I still hadn't decided what to do with all this information. Part of me hoped that maybe I was wrong, that maybe there was some legitimate explanation for everything I'd discovered. Part of me hoped to believe that Marcus, despite his flaws, wouldn't actually risk federal prosecution just to make himself richer. That hope died on a Tuesday evening in August, when I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. I'd been working late again, trying to finish a compliance review that should have been completed weeks earlier if I'd had proper support from the executive team. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor, and I heard voices coming from Marcus's corner office. I should have announced myself or gotten back on the elevator immediately. Instead, something made me pause and listen. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was just the paranoia that had been building up over months of being systematically excluded and undermined. "Sarah's getting too close to the real numbers," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. "She's been asking too many questions about the subsidiary investments and the cash flow projections. We need to move faster on the transition." Another voice, which I recognized as belonging to David Morrison, our chief financial officer, responded with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry about Sarah. She's always been too focused on the details to see the bigger picture. Besides, we've already started the process of restructuring her department. She'll be gone long before she figures out what's really happening. They're not even going to offer her a severance package, are they?" This was a third voice, someone I couldn't immediately identify. "Why would we?" Marcus replied. "She's been nothing but an obstacle to progress around here. Always questioning our strategies, always slowing down important decisions with her compliance concerns. The company will be better off without her negative attitude dragging down team morale." That was the moment I realized that everything I'd suspected was not only true, but actually worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just planning to fire me, they were planning to destroy my professional reputation in the process. They were going to make it look like I was incompetent, difficult to work with, someone who couldn't adapt to changing business conditions. I rode that elevator back down to my floor in complete silence, but inside my head, everything was crystal clear for the first time in months. They wanted to get rid of me because I knew too much, because I was too honest, because I represented a threat to their illegal scheme. But they had no idea that I'd been documenting their every move for months. That night, I went home and did something I'd never done before in my entire professional career. I called in sick the next day, not because I was ill, but because I needed time to think and plan. I spent 14 hours organizing every piece of evidence I'd collected, creating a comprehensive report that laid out the entire merger conspiracy in chronological order. I also did something else that night. I created multiple backup copies of everything and stored them in different locations, some digital, some physical. I opened a safe deposit box at a bank across town and put copies of the most important documents inside. I sent encrypted files to my personal email account and to a secure cloud storage service that wasn't connected to Sterling Financial in any way. By the time I went back to work the following Monday, I was ready for whatever they threw at me. I knew they were planning to fire me, and I knew exactly why. But what they didn't know was that I was already 3 steps ahead of them, with evidence that could bring down their entire operation and potentially land several of them in federal prison. The next few weeks were like watching a slow-motion car accident. They continued to exclude me from important meetings, continued to undermine my authority, continued to treat me like I was already gone. But now I understood exactly what they were doing and why, which made it easier to document their behavior and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. I started carrying a digital recorder to every meeting, keeping detailed notes about every conversation, and forwarding copies of important emails to my personal account. I also started reaching out to employment attorneys, not because I was planning to sue for wrongful termination, but because I wanted to understand my legal options and make sure I was protected when everything finally came to light. The most satisfying part was watching Marcus and his team congratulate themselves on how cleverly they were handling the situation. They thought they were being so sophisticated, so strategic. They had no idea that every move they made was being documented and analyzed by someone who understood their business better than they did. 3 weeks before that final board meeting, I made a decision that would change everything. I contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission and filed a formal whistleblower complaint, complete with all the evidence I'd been collecting for months. I didn't tell them I was about to be fired, but I did make it clear that I might face retaliation for coming forward with this information. The SEC investigator I spoke with was impressed by the quality and completeness of my documentation. He told me that cases like this one, with such clear evidence of securities fraud and insider trading, were exactly the kind of violations they were looking for. He also informed me that under federal whistleblower protection laws, I could be entitled to a substantial financial reward if my information led to successful enforcement action. That reward, he explained, could be anywhere from 10 to 30% of whatever penalties the SEC ultimately collected from Sterling Financial and the individuals involved in the scheme. Based on the scope of the violations I'd documented, we were potentially talking about millions of dollars in penalties, which meant my reward could be substantial enough to set me up financially for the rest of my life. But the money wasn't really the point, although I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a nice bonus. The real satisfaction was knowing that Marcus and his cronies were about to face the consequences of their actions. They thought they could push me out quietly and continue with their illegal scheme, but they had seriously underestimated what they were dealing with. The day before that final board meeting, I received a call from the SEC investigator, informing me that they had reviewed my complaint and were opening a formal investigation into Sterling Financial's merger activities. He also warned me that the company might take retaliatory action against me once they realized what was happening, and advised me to document any such retaliation carefully. I thanked him for the warning, but I didn't bother telling him that I already knew exactly what Sterling Financial was planning to do to me. In fact, I was counting on it. Their decision to fire me publicly in front of the entire senior staff was going to be the final piece of evidence I needed to prove that everything I'd told the SEC was absolutely true. So when I walked into that conference room and heard Marcus deliver his carefully rehearsed termination speech, I wasn't angry or upset or surprised. I was actually relieved that it was finally happening, because it meant that the next phase of my plan could begin. As I sat in that coffee shop, watching the Sterling Financial building through the window and sipping my cappuccino, I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The subject line was simple and direct. Retaliation confirmed, evidence attached, investigation should proceed immediately. In the body of the email, I described exactly what had happened in that board meeting, including the specific language Marcus had used and the presence of witnesses who could corroborate my account. I attached audio recordings I'd made of previous conversations, along with additional financial documents that I'd been saving for exactly this moment. But I didn't send the email right away. Instead, I wanted to give Marcus and his team a little time to celebrate their victory, and maybe make some additional mistakes that would only strengthen my case. I knew that over the next few days, they would probably start accelerating their merger timeline, thinking that they'd successfully eliminated the biggest threat to their scheme. What they didn't realize was that they'd actually just handed me the strongest possible evidence of retaliation, and given the SEC investigators even more reason to take my complaint seriously. By firing me so publicly and so dramatically, they'd essentially admitted that they saw me as a threat that needed to be eliminated. I finished my cappuccino and closed my laptop, but I didn't leave the coffee shop right away. Instead, I sat there for another hour, watching people come and go from the Sterling Financial building and thinking about how different my life was about to become. In a few days, when the SEC investigation became public knowledge, everyone would know that I'd been right about everything. Marcus Blackwood had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. And he didn't even know it yet, but he was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to silence someone who knows where all the bodies are buried. And this was only the beginning. The first sign that my plan was working came exactly 72 hours after Marcus fired me. I was having breakfast at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh, one of the junior analysts who had always been friendly to me, despite the toxic atmosphere in the executive wing. The message was short but told me everything I needed to know. Sarah, something big is happening at the office. SEC investigators showed up an hour ago, with boxes and badges. Marcus looks like he's seen a ghost. I set down my coffee cup and smiled for the first time in months. The federal investigation I'd triggered was moving faster than I'd expected, which meant the evidence I'd provided was even more compelling than I'd hoped. I opened my laptop and checked the secure email account I'd set up specifically for this situation. There were 3 new messages waiting for me. The first was from my contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, confirming that they had executed search warrants at Sterling Financial's offices and were in the process of seizing documents and computer files related to the Meridian merger investigation. He thanked me again for the comprehensive evidence I'd provided and informed me that my complaint had been instrumental in fast-tracking the enforcement action. The second email was from a reporter at the Financial Times who had somehow gotten wind of the investigation and wanted to interview me about my role as a whistleblower. Word was already starting to leak out, which meant Marcus and his team were about to face the kind of public scrutiny they'd been desperately trying to avoid. The third email was the one that made me laugh out loud. It was from Marcus himself, sent from his personal email account rather than his corporate address. The subject line read, "Urgent conversation needed," and the message was a masterpiece of panic, disguised as professional courtesy. Sarah, there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding with federal regulators regarding our recent business activities. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter with you at your earliest convenience. Please call me as soon as possible. I deleted the email without responding. Marcus Blackwood could wait for answers, just like he'd made me wait for respect and recognition during my 3 years at Sterling Financial. The difference was that I'd used my waiting time productively, while he was about to discover that his time was running out completely. By noon, the story had broken on every major financial news website. Sterling Financial was being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential securities fraud related to undisclosed merger negotiations with Meridian Capital. Trading in Sterling stock had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, and several executives, including the chief executive officer, were being questioned by federal investigators. My phone started ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews, former colleagues wanted explanations, and employment attorneys wanted to represent me in what they were calling one of the most significant whistleblower cases in recent memory. But I didn't answer any of the calls. I was waiting for one specific conversation, and I knew it would come soon enough. That conversation happened at 4:17 in the afternoon. Marcus called from a number I didn't recognize, probably hoping I wouldn't see his name on the caller ID. His voice was strained and desperate in a way I'd never heard before, all traces of his usual arrogant confidence completely gone. "Sarah," he began, "I know you're upset about how things ended between us, but this investigation is going to hurt everyone at Sterling Financial, including people who had nothing to do with any business decisions. Innocent employees are going to lose their jobs because of this situation." I let him talk for almost 5 minutes, listening as he tried every manipulation technique in his playbook. He offered me money, promised me a better position if I helped make the investigation go away, even suggested that maybe we could work together to find a solution that would benefit everyone involved. When he finally stopped talking, I responded with a calmness that surprised even me. "Marcus," I said, "you fired me in front of 20 people because you thought I was a threat to your illegal merger scheme. You destroyed my reputation and tried to end my career because I knew too much about what you were really doing. Now you want my help because you're facing federal charges and possible prison time. The irony is absolutely perfect. But Sarah, he started to say, and I cut him off immediately. You had every opportunity to do the right thing, I continued. When I first discovered the irregularities in the subsidiary investments, I could have reported them immediately. Instead, I gave you months to come clean, to involve me in legitimate discussions about the company's future, to treat me with the basic respect that any professional deserves. But you chose to lie, scheme, and eventually fire me because you thought I was expendable. The line was quiet for several seconds before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want, Sarah? Money? A promotion? Your old job back? Just tell me what it will take to make this go away. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered sitting in that conference room 3 days earlier, listening to him humiliate me in front of my colleagues while he smiled and acted like he was doing me a favor. I remembered all the meetings I'd been excluded from, all the credit I'd been denied, all the times my expertise had been dismissed because it inconvenienced his plans. What I want, Marcus, is for you to face the consequences of your actions. I want the Securities and Exchange Commission to recover every penny you and your friends tried to steal from shareholders. I want everyone who works in corporate America to understand that there are still people who believe in honesty and integrity, even when it's difficult and dangerous. I hung up the phone before he could respond. Within an hour, I received a formal cease and desist letter from Sterling Financial's legal team, demanding that I stop cooperating with federal investigators and threatening to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate espionage. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney and to my contact at the SEC, both of whom assured me that the threats were completely baseless and actually provided additional evidence of retaliation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of depositions, interviews, and legal proceedings. The SEC's investigation moved forward with unprecedented speed, thanks largely to the comprehensive documentation I'd provided. Federal investigators were able to trace the entire merger conspiracy, from the initial secret negotiations to the elaborate scheme for enriching executives at shareholders' expense. Marcus and 3 other Sterling Financial executives were arrested on charges of securities fraud, insider trading, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The company's board of directors fired Marcus immediately and announced that they were cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Sterling's stock price collapsed completely, wiping out hundreds of millions in shareholder value. But the most satisfying moment came 6 weeks after my termination, when I received a call from the Securities and Exchange Commission informing me that their investigation had resulted in the largest financial penalty in the agency's history. Sterling Financial and its executives would pay over $200 million in fines and restitution, and under federal whistleblower protection laws, I was entitled to 22% of that recovery. The math was staggering. My reward for exposing Marcus's fraud scheme would be just over $44 million, paid out over 3 years to protect both the government's interests and my own financial security. I would never have to work again if I didn't want to, and I would have the resources to pursue any professional opportunity that interested me. But the money, while certainly life-changing, wasn't the most important outcome. The real victory was watching Marcus Blackwood get arrested on live television, led away in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions about his role in one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in recent memory. The man who had fired me for asking inconvenient questions was now facing 20 years in federal prison. 3 months after the investigation began, I started receiving job offers from companies across the country. Word had spread throughout the financial industry that I was the whistleblower who had exposed the Sterling Financial fraud, and suddenly everyone wanted to hire someone with my integrity and attention to detail. Investment firms, regulatory agencies, consulting companies, and law firms all reached out with opportunities that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. I accepted a position with Morrison Strategic Advisory, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in helping companies navigate complex regulatory environments. My role was to identify potential compliance issues before they became major problems, essentially doing proactively what I'd done reactively at Sterling Financial. The irony wasn't lost on me that my new job was preventing exactly the kind of fraud that had destroyed my old company. But I also decided to use my platform and resources for something even more important. I established the Chen Foundation for Corporate Integrity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting and protecting corporate whistleblowers. Too many honest employees stay silent about fraud and corruption because they're afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of being blacklisted by entire industries. The foundation provides legal support, financial assistance, and career counseling for people who risk everything to expose corporate wrongdoing. We help them understand their rights, connect them with experienced attorneys, and provide financial bridge loans so they can afford to do the right thing, even when it's professionally dangerous. Within the first year, we'd helped 17 whistleblowers come forward with information about securities fraud, environmental violations, and workplace safety issues. Their courage resulted in over $600 million in penalties and restitution, money that went back to defrauded investors and communities harmed by corporate negligence. I also started speaking at business schools and professional conferences, sharing my story and encouraging the next generation of business leaders to prioritize ethics over profit margins. The response was always overwhelming, especially from young women who saw in my experience a roadmap for standing up to powerful men who tried to silence and marginalize them. One of my most memorable speaking engagements was at my own alma mater, where I addressed a packed auditorium of graduate students studying finance and business administration. I told them about the choice I'd faced when I first discovered evidence of fraud at Sterling Financial. The choice between keeping quiet to protect my career and speaking up to protect innocent investors. The easiest thing would have been to pretend I hadn't seen anything, I explained to those bright young faces staring back at me from the audience. I could have kept my head down, collected my paycheck, and let someone else deal with the consequences of Marcus's illegal scheme. But that would have made me complicit in the fraud, and I refused to be the kind of person who stays silent when silence enables harm. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me that she was working as an intern at a major investment firm where she'd witnessed behavior that seemed unethical but wasn't sure what to do about it. She was afraid that reporting her concerns would end her career before it even started, but she also couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent. I spent an hour talking with her about her options, connecting her with resources through the foundation, and reassuring her that doing the right thing, while sometimes difficult in the short term, always leads to better outcomes in the long run. 6 months later, her information helped expose a major insider trading scheme that resulted in multiple arrests and significant financial penalties. Marcus Blackwood was eventually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison in order to pay over $30 million in personal restitution. His conviction was front-page news in every major financial publication, a public reminder that even the most powerful executives aren't above the law when they choose to commit fraud. David Morrison, the chief financial officer who had laughed about my termination, received a 12-year sentence and was banned from working in the financial industry for life. The other executives involved in the scheme received similar penalties, their careers and reputations destroyed by their own greed and arrogance. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't their punishment. It was the transformation of Sterling Financial itself. Under new leadership, the company implemented comprehensive ethics and compliance programs designed to prevent exactly the kind of fraud that had nearly destroyed them. They established anonymous reporting systems, mandatory ethics training, and regular independent audits of all major business decisions. They also reached out to me personally, not to offer me a job, but to apologize for how I'd been treated, and to ask for my advice on building a corporate culture that valued integrity over profit margins. I accepted their apology and provided recommendations through my consulting firm, helping them rebuild their reputation and regain the trust of investors and regulators. 5 years after Marcus fired me in that marble conference room, I found myself back in a similar setting, but this time as a keynote speaker at the National Association of Corporate Ethics annual conference. The audience was filled with compliance officers, corporate attorneys, and business executives who had come to hear about the Sterling Financial case and its implications for corporate governance. I stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of faces, remembering how isolated and powerless I'd felt during those final months at Sterling Financial. The contrast was remarkable. Then, I'd been silenced and marginalized by people who saw my integrity as an obstacle to their ambitions. Now, I was being celebrated and sought after by organizations that recognized integrity as their most valuable asset. In my closing remarks, I returned to the theme that had driven every decision I'd made since discovering Marcus's fraud scheme. Real power doesn't come from position, or title, or salary, I told the audience. Real power comes from having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when everyone around you is choosing the easy path of looking the other way. When powerful people try to silence you, when they try to make you feel small and insignificant, when they fire you for asking inconvenient questions, remember that they're only doing those things because they're afraid of what you know and what you represent. Your integrity is a threat to their corruption, and that's exactly why it's so important to never surrender it. The audience gave me a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes, but the real reward was the conversations that followed. Young professionals approached me with their own stories of ethical dilemmas, seeking guidance on how to navigate complex situations where doing the right thing might come at significant personal cost. Each conversation reminded me that my decision to expose Marcus's fraud hadn't just been about one company or one merger scheme. It had been about establishing a precedent, about proving that ordinary people with extraordinary integrity could still hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that humiliating termination meeting to this moment of recognition and respect. Marcus Blackwood had thought he was ending my career when he fired me in front of 20 colleagues. Instead, he'd inadvertently launched me into a new career that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have achieved at Sterling Financial. The irony was perfect, and I smiled thinking about it. Marcus had spent his entire professional life accumulating power and wealth through deception and manipulation, and in the end, he'd lost everything to someone who simply refused to compromise her principles. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but rather the quiet satisfaction of watching integrity triumph over corruption, truth triumph over lies, and justice triumph over greed. Today, when young professionals ask me for career advice, I tell them the same thing I learned during those difficult months at Sterling Financial. Your reputation is the only thing you truly own in your professional life, and it's also the only thing that nobody can take away from you without your permission. Guard it carefully, build it honestly, and never sacrifice it for temporary advantage or convenience. Because in the end, the people who try to silence you, who try to diminish you, who fire you for being inconveniently honest, they're not your enemies. They're your opportunity to prove what you're really made of, and to show the world that some things are still more important than profit margins in corporate politics. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.